name to one of the last quarter.
Oh, good.
Oh,
You speak Serbian?
Croatian, yes.
Oh, Croatian.
So-
Također pričam.
Ja sad sam mislila da neće znati Srbić.
Ona je moja devojka. Da, što ja pričam. Ja učim.
Okay. Excellent pronunciation.
Hvala puno.
All right, so it's my pleasure to welcome our next speaker, Anastasios Angelopoulos, who is currently a postdoc and I think soon to take up a faculty position somewhere. So Anastasios, I've known his work in many facets, so I'll just mention some of those. And maybe that's coming back in reverse chronological order. He's actually very well known as being one of a group that developed this chatbot evaluation system called Chatbot Arena that all the industry companies and probably academic groups around the world are using to compete with each other and see how well they can do. He's also written a really very nice exposition, a monograph on conformal prediction that many people have used. And of course, all of that is in addition to his PhD thesis work and his other research, which is going to be, I think, in part the subject of today's talk on prediction-powered inference. So Anastasios, welcome.
Thanks so much. And thanks for the very generous introduction and the invitation. It's great to talk to everybody. So I'm going to be talking today about a topic that's called prediction-powered inference, which is a paper that I worked on with these wonderful co-authors, some of whom you might know, a couple of years ago, and we've continued building on ever since. And the basic idea of prediction-powered inference is we're in this world where we have all these wonderful generative models, language models, image generation models, models that can generate 3D objects, so on and so forth. How can we take these systems and essentially generate synthetic data that can help us learn about the world? Okay, so how can it help us do scientific inference if we have access to a great generative model? And yeah, I'll be talking about certain facets of that problem and progress towards that goal. Of course, it's all partial progress and there's more to be done. So the core problem that we're trying to solve is that scientific measurements are expensive, right? If you go to somebody to say, hey, I want to study, I want to do regressions that tell me about the distribution of proteins in the natural world. Well, maybe that means that I need to do X-ray crystallography in order to make that happen. And that's a tough thing to do. It can take weeks to do this, crystallizing the protein, taking the measurements, training somebody to do it, cost millions of dollars to buy the machine, so on and so forth. Let's say I want to tell you about the distribution of plankton in the deep sea. That might mean that I need to go out and send an imaging system into the deep sea that, of course, I need to build, and then spend a lot of time with a human annotating the images from that system, preferably an expert human, to tell me, all the different types of plankton that are in there. And same thing in astronomy. It's not that hard to take pictures of space, but there's a lot of space to take pictures of, and you need somebody to sift through all of that in order to label it. So how can we reduce the burden of all of this data collection? How can we use potentially machine learning to substitute as a cheap measurement for the expensive expert measurements that we would otherwise sort of splurge for? And the insight, quite simply, is the following. What I'm showing you is two, inspired by AlphaFold, which is DeepMind's protein folding system they built a few years ago and they've continued improving on. I'm showing you a protein, the 3D fold of a protein, one of which is the real X-ray crystallography fold, and the other of which is the AlphaFold prediction of what that should be. And so, it's a game. You're supposed to spot the difference. And the differences are kind of minor. This one has some weird artifacts due to these dots. But in general, these proteins, the structures are almost entirely identical. Now, this is a common protein. It's like GFP, if you guys know Greek for us, protein. But nonetheless, like the fact that AlphaFold V2 can do this is inspiring people to say, hey, well, if we can produce structures that are so faithful, can we then use them, on structures that are unknown to us a priori in order to estimate things about the distribution of proteins? Yeah, so this, the fact that AlphaFold exists inspires this brilliant idea, which is we know way more amino acid sequences than we know 3D folds of proteins. So we can go look up every protein known to man, look at its amino acid sequence and say, hey, let's run a for loop. That's it. Take AlphaFold and predict every structure and then put that into a database and we're done. Do we even need experimental measurements? Okay, it's a question. And of course, there's many reasons why this would be very convenient, right? Gold standard measurements are rare, predictions are abundant. Gold standard measurements are expensive, predictions are cheap. Gold standard is slow, predictions are fast. Gold standard is difficult to obtain, predictions are easy. Okay, so for all these reasons, we want to substitute as much gold standard data as we can with predictions. And this is actually happening. This is a paper from, a year plus ago. And so I'm sure the trend has accelerated since then, but this is a study that uses AlphaFold predictions sort of out of the distribution of known proteins in order to estimate an odds ratio that has to do with, the biology probably is not that relevant to us here, but the association between post-translational modifications of a protein, which is, let's say, I'm going to put a methyl group, attach a methyl group to a protein, and the presence of an intrinsically disordered region in a protein, which means that it's floppy. So do floppy regions in the protein get post-translational modifications more or less often than the average section of protein? That's what they're studying. And the intrinsically disordered region part, the floppiness, is a structure prediction, right? That's something that you can sort of obtain via AlphaFold, basically by looking at its uncertainty in the fold. So this is the estimand that they're trying to look for. Yeah, so this is my little joke. We used to use data, we thought it was data science. Actually, we're replacing all the data with predictions. Okay. But the problem with this strategy, as anybody who's familiar with these models knows, is that they can be problematic, right? Okay, that's all fine if the predictions are 100% accurate, or if their errors are somehow like uncorrelated with anything we're interested in. But in reality, what's happening is this is a protein that is intrinsically disordered, and exactly in the region where it's intrinsically disordered, the model makes an error. Okay, so one of these is AlphaFold, and it's curved the wrong way with respect to the gold standard measurement. So yeah, going back to the table, yeah, predictions are abundant, cheap, fast, and easy, but unlike gold standard measurements, they're of questionable quality. All right, but gold standard measurements are the gold standard for a reason. So the question of prediction-powered inference is how to combine these, just to preview it, in such a way that you retain statistical validity while being able to leverage the predictions in order to gain as much statistical power as possible. So going back to this analysis from this biology paper that I referenced earlier, what we did is we took the data from that paper and we took a perturbed version of it. It's not exactly the study that they ran, but sort of a subset of it where the labels are known. And we asked, okay, if you were to use AlphaFold to do their analysis on this subset, then how bad would the bias be? So this gold interval is the interval that you would obtain using just the imputations from AlphaFold on their study. Okay, this is like the analogy of what they did. And then this dotted line is the ground truth odds ratio that we know because we know all of the labels in this subset. So that's bad, right? Because what's happening is that this is the estimate that we thought was correct. And not only is it wrong by a lot, but also the confidence interval is wrong by a lot, by like a factor of 6 or something. Because in order to cover the true odds ratio, you would need to inflate it to account for the uncertainty that has to do with, the errors in the model, right? Okay, so we can also be like super conservative and say we don't want to do this. Instead, let's only look at the classical estimate, just one second, which is what we would do if we only had gold standard labels. But the problem is we don't have enough of those, so we cover one. And prediction-powered inference tries to find a happy medium. Let's use both the data sets together in such a way that we can sort of have an actually valid confidence interval that's smaller due to the fact that we have all these great predictions.
Yeah. Yeah, sorry, clarification question, because we have multiple communities and the terms may not be familiar to all. So can you explain what odds ratio means and how to actually interpret this diagram?
Yeah, absolutely. So the odds ratio is like the ratio of like the probability that an event would happen in one group over another. And so that's the target of that. Like when I say the association between intrinsically disordered regions and post-translational modifications, that's one way of expressing like the ground truth object, which is that association. So the ground truth like odds ratio, which is this like ratio of odds, right? Ratio of probabilities is this dotted line. And the fact that this confidence interval doesn't cover it is a bad thing, right? It means we're missing the target that we actually want to cover. Yeah, does that maybe address the point? Yeah. Yes, mostly. Good. So going on to the method, prediction powered inference, you want to use both the gold standard data and the predictions. It's model agnostic, so you don't want to make any assumptions about how good your predictor is. It's just a black box model. It's just an AI system that someone else trained, like AlphaFold. When the model's good, you want the sets to be small. When it's bad, ideally, they're no worse than the classical algorithm that you would run if you only had gold standard data. And it should be finite sample valid, if possible. And there's asymptotic versions too, if you want to use the central limit theorem. It should apply also to most common estimates. That's sort of the goals. And actually, today I'm going to present the asymptotic versions because they're just easier for exposition. But there's sort of finite sample analogies to these that we can talk about. So let's now abstract this into a mathematical setup. What I'm going to give you is labeled data, x's and y's, that are IID from some probability distribution P. Let's say we have little n of these. Okay, little n is going to be my small amount. And then in addition, I'm going to give you a bunch of unlabeled data, which is x tildes, y tildes. And these are going to be IID from P, but there's going to be big N of them. So little n of these, big N of these, big N being bigger than little n. And for both sort of splits of this data, we're going to have predictions from our black box model. And we're just going to assume these predictions, these Fs, are like, F of X is a fixed, well, F is a fixed model. So it's not learned. We're not averaging over the randomness of the learning there. We're just thinking about this as something that someone else gave us in order to run predictions on our X's. Okay. And then the formal goal is to produce a confidence interval CPP that contains theta star with the right fraction of the time. So this is the coverage of our confidence interval should be 1 minus alpha at least.
What is theta star?
Theta star is the ground truth estimate. Like in the context of our odds ratio, it'd be the true odds ratio. If we're doing mean estimation, if we're trying to estimate the average of something, it would be the true average.
Is that just the value or the function?
Jerry, can you just wait for the mic?
Okay.
I can actually just say he's asking. Yes, you go ahead. Sure.
All right. So is f the predicted value, like a real number, or is it a function?
Yeah. So there might be some mixed notation in this, but what I'll say is f, the model, is fixed, and I think I'll usually refer to the predictions as f of x.
And so what's f tilde? So that just means the predicted thing. It's
Yeah,
like
f of x tilde. Yeah.
Okay, got it. Thanks.
It's probably better notation for that.
I see. So the follow-up to my earlier question is theta star, I should think of it as some function of f of x tilde.
You should think about theta star as a function of the distribution.
Of
So
the
for example,
distribution.
like it could be expected value of y. That would be theta star. Another example of theta star would be like the population ordinarily squares coefficients, yeah, relating x and y. Good. So now let me give you an example of a prediction powered estimation algorithm where our target is the average, the expected value of y. And we have these expensive measurements, cheap measurements, and this large pool of cheap measurements, which you should think of as like the f of x tildes, right? Okay, and these are the f of x's. So what we're going to do is so the standard thing to do, the classical, would be just to take 1 over n sum I equals 1 to n of yi. That's what we would do if we didn't want to use any of the predictions. Just take the average. Fine. The prediction powered estimator does something slightly different. What it's going to do is it's going to do 1 over big N, sum I equals 1 through big N, of the y hat prime i's, which are the f of x, the predictions. And then this thing is going to be possibly biased, right? Because the predictions are not necessarily any good. So what we're going to do is we're going to add a debiasing term. Okay. So what we've done is we've centered ourselves at the imputed thing the basically infinite data imputed thing that we would do if we just trusted our model. And then we're debiasing it by looking at these, like looking at the small labeled data set where we have these model and ground truth label pairs, and we can do the debiasing. Right? Yep. There's a factor 1/2.
Isn't it like, don't you divide both estimate by?
Oh, because you want to do like
no,
2n, 2n?
No, sorry.
Yeah, it's not. Yeah, right. I think I know why you're saying it. And it's a reasonable instinct. Yeah.
Also to clarify notation here, so and compare it to the motivation at the beginning. So the expensive measurements are like your gold standard measurements.
Yeah, that's these guys.
The y's, okay, and then the y hats. That's the thing I find confusing. You say you call them cheap measurements, but
these are the predictions.
But those are the labels, right? So you can trust those predictions.
These are like the imputed labels. In other words, the predicted labels.
The predicted labels for those same data items.
The same, yes, exactly.
Oh, I
so these
see.
have
Okay.
These are sort of coupled through X.
Uh-huh.
And that's
I see.
part of the
Okay.
juice.
Okay, got it. Okay, now I understand what you're doing.
Yeah. Any more questions here? Good. Okay. So the proposition basically is that the estimator previously, which I've just written here, it's unbiased, okay? And if you use the central limit theorem in a particular way by adding plus or minus, the variance, which has this variance of y minus y hat and the variance of y hat in it, divided by n and little n and big N, that this interval is valid. And it's asymptotically equal to the right coverage level. So let's just think about this for a second. Why do we care about this proposition? It's because if you look at this variance term, the difference between this and the classical confidence intervals, it could be quite large if your model is good. Why is that? It's because think about this big N term as being 0. Big N is just so large that we don't care about it. All of the variance is dominated by the little n term. So this guy is just like infinite, no variance there. And we're just thinking about this guy. If y hat is close to y, the difference is small. Right? The variation in the differences is also small if the difference is small, which means that the standard deviation is small, which makes our confidence intervals tighter. If y minus y hat is substantially smaller than the variation, if the variation in y minus y hat is substantially smaller than the variation that we would see in y alone, just by using the standard classical estimator, then this thing will be much smaller. And that's what we mean when we say, when the model's good, my inferences will be better. These will be more powerful. Okay? So we can actually just show both of these things. Let's just look at the expected value of theta hat. Expected value of theta hat is equal to, just by linearity, expected value of y hat I plus, just take it through, expected value of yi plus expected value of y hat I, and these two cancel because they're the same. Yeah.
All right, a question maybe jumping too much ahead, but is there a empirical Bernstein version of your
Absolutely
bound that will knock down that log square root little n?
I mean, you can see, let's just say, with any concentration inequality, you can see that just by looking at this expression. And the reason is because this thing concentrates and this thing concentrates. That's all.
So if your model is really nice, you can really anticipate even a sharper rate.
Absolutely.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, I mean, sharper than Hufting, yeah. I mean, the central limit theorem is sharp, but yeah, in finite samples, yes. Okay. Oh, we didn't prove it yet. Okay, we have to keep going. So that's the mean. That's how we know it's unbiased. And the variance, the variance term that I brought up earlier is just because this is independent from this. These two things are coupled. The variance is just 1 over n variance of y hat prime I plus 1 over little n variance of yi minus y hat I. And so, the standard deviation is the square root of this, and that's what I had on the slide earlier. It's pretty simple to see. Good. It's also simple to implement. I mean, this is, like 8 lines of code. We have a package for it online if you're interested in ever running these techniques. It's like PPI Py, or like you can pip install PPI Python if you're using Python. And it's been sort of fun to see people using these things. We also have a few applications in the papers that we've done on these topics. One is for estimating the fraction of spiral galaxies in the early universe. So there's this project that's called Galaxy Zoo 2, where it's a crowdsourcing project to do exactly what I said in the sort of early part of my talk when I was saying, hey, galaxy, it's hard to like label the whole night sky because there's just too many things to look at. Well, these folks at Galaxy Zoo had the idea of doing a citizen science project where you can like ask people to label the number of spiral arms in these galaxies in order to see, because this is associated with like certain aspects of the formation of the early universe. This tells them something that's above my head in terms of the astronomy. Yeah, of course, it'd be great if we could just use a machine learning model to do this. We have all this data that's come from crowdsourcing. Can we use ML to train a model to predict the number of spiral arms and then use that sort of in addition to or instead of these crowdsourced labels or the small amount of expert labels that we might be able to have on top? So we did this using the Galaxy Zoo data that they released, and these are the empirical results from that, just from the mean estimation procedure that I put on the previous slide. What it looks like is this here is a few different random draws, like resampling the data to tell us what the confidence intervals look like. And you'll see this is the prediction-powered confidence intervals. These are the classical confidence intervals. They're bigger. And this is the imputed thing that you would have if you just used the model itself. Like if you just believed the model and took all big N and averaged them. And so these are the widths, the average widths with the function of this resampling as a function of N. And so what you'll see is that the savings are actually quite large. Like if I take a horizontal line and say, how many samples do I need to collect in order to achieve a width of, alpha? Then that's a big difference, right? That's the intersections here versus like here. So it's approximately a factor of 2. Pretty good savings on your budget. Now, the next thing I'll say is, before moving on into some more extensions of this technique and more generalities beyond mean estimation, is this idea of mean estimation using this sort of control variate thing is not that new. The idea appears like all over different areas of statistics and control and so on and so forth. So there's this thing called model-assisted survey sampling where people will do this, not with machine learning, but with they'll send a surveyor out to like measure the height of trees. And then, for 95% of trees, they'll just eyeball it. That tree's like 10 meters high. And then for 5% of trees, they'll go out there with like a big ruler and they'll, measure it. They'll like climb up the tree and bring a string with them and so on. So that's like how people do this with surveys. Again, not with machine learning. And there's also sort of a big field of causal inference that has to do with missing data that has relationship with the ideas that I'm bringing up here. Semi-parametric statistics has related ideas. Semi-supervised learning, of course, has the setting of semi-supervision in it. So just know that this idea has sort of like been floating around. One sort of interesting next step beyond mean estimation would be convex estimation. What if we're looking for the empirical risk minimizer or the population risk minimizer of a convex risk? Average of convex losses. So, in mean estimation, that would be like, quadratic loss. In quantile estimation, that would be like the pinball loss. Ordinary least squares and logistic regression, these are sort of defined by optimization problems anyway. The question is, for such optimization problems, can we also get a power benefit via using predictions instead of, real data? And the answer is yes. And this is joint work with Tiana Zudnich and John Ducci. Now, the first part of this is to say, like I told you guys earlier, it'd be great if when the model was bad, we didn't lose, right? Because in the earlier argument I gave you, if the predictions are actually worse, sort of like if they're random, we're actually increasing our variance. But we developed a tool where that we call power tuning that's pretty simple and allows you to escape this and prove that, at least asymptotically, you're all good. You're like equally as good. You're better than both the classical solution and the imputed solution and the PPI, like the PPI solution with no tuning. And the way it works is you just are mixing between the gold standard labels and the prediction powered estimate in the optimal way. And this mixing parameter you can learn online in a way that asymptotically it converges and makes things okay. So the idea is you're interpolating when lambda equals 0, it's just the classical solution. It's y bar, the average of the y's on the labeled data. And when lambda equals 1, it's the standard prediction powered estimator that I showed you earlier. But you can pick this lambda star in the middle, which we have an explicit expression for. It involves some oracle quantities like these covariances, but these can be estimated. And this will, guarantee you that you're lower variance than both the classical solution and the original PPI thing that I showed you earlier. Okay. Now, talking about general targets, if we parameterize theta star as the argmin of an expected loss, then what we can do is we can solve what we call a rectified optimization problem, where this little term here, which is the debiasing term from earlier, we call that a rectifier because it sort of fixes this. And what happens is that you can form this loss function, and for any value of theta, it's unbiased for the ground truth loss.
I'm curious, with the power tuning, do you have a way to keep the estimator unbiased, or does it end up being slightly biased if you?
Oh, yeah. So this is actually unbiased as it stands.
If you tune on the one set of data and then tune the lambda on one set.
I see.
And then fit it with the other, aren't you fitting it in the same data that you're tuning into?
Yeah. So for any fixed lambda, this is unbiased, right? The question is, if we fit lambda on the same data that we use for estimation, is it biased? Yes, but it is consistent. Yeah. So this is an asymptotic argument here. And of course, you can do exactly what you said, which is data splitting if you want to do it in finite samples. Yeah. But perhaps there's another way to do this in finite samples that remains unbiased and uses the data the right way. I don't know. It'd be a great trick. Yeah, I wish we did. Yeah, so moving back to general targets, you can form sort of this rectified risk, and using sort of the standard risk minimization techniques, you can show that this is consistent and follows the central limit theorem as well. Yeah, at least for generalized linear models. You can't do this for all losses. But there's a special trick for generalized linear models that allows you to do this. So Now let me sort of finish out with a couple cool examples. So this is a fun one. This is a plankton counting. This is like the deep sea plankton counting thing that I mentioned in the introduction. There's these folks, Heidi Sosik and Rob Olson, who work at the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institute, and they built this thing that's called the Imaging Flow Cytobot, which is basically like this little missile that you put in the ocean, and it has a flow cytometer in it, and it will just every so often it'll pump water through, and it has an imaging system that like will capture it'll capture bright field images of all of the plankton that it sees in the ocean, and they're using this to measure things like, is there an algal bloom, and how does that associate with waste and affect the ecology of the area around the institute. So this is the imaging flow cytobot. And then the key question that they want to answer is the size of algal blooms over time. So, year by year, they're measuring all of these images, and they're asking how many like plankton are there, and of what different species. When there are blooms, that can affect the environment. So when does that happen and why? Those are the key questions that they want to answer through this cytometry system. And so in order to answer this question in this sort of like science paper that introduces this topic, what they do is they hand label over 400,000 images of plankton per year. Those 3 people are doing it, right? So this is like, just do the division. There's 400,000 plankton, there's 3 people, and there's 365 days in a year. Now, how many plankton are these people labeling in a day? It's ridiculous, right? That's why it's a science paper. They're like really put in the effort to measure all these plankton. But this is exactly the sort of thing that we would hope machine learning would be able to step in and help us make more efficient. Because, at some point they have to stop. And now the system's still running, but a lot of these images are, I think actually all of the images are unlabeled. So what do we do next? So what we can do is, and this is their interface. Okay, wait, there's a video. Come on. No, it doesn't work. Oh, that's too bad. But I had a video here of their there it is. But yeah, so that's where they are on Martha's Vineyard. And then you can look at all these different buckets of data that they've collected. These are all their different plankton. And they want to like categorize them by different species. Obviously, it takes an expert eye. But a lot of these things like that's detritus. That just means like some stuff that's floating in the water that's non-plankton. And actually, a lot of their job is to sift through the detritus and make sure things aren't detritus. They just want to count the plankton. Just the raw number of plankton is interesting to them. And that's like all those different bins with the number of plankton that they're counting in given like day or hour, right? It's a massive system. It's very cool. So let's just say what our estimate is going to be the number of plankton, in a given, year. So what we can do is we can use PPI for this, right? We can label a small amount of that plankton data. Let's say, a few hundred data points that are detritus or plankton. And then we can use the model to tell us what the number is by backing that out from the prediction powered estimator. That's it. And when you do that, you get a big benefit. You need to label half or a third of the data, just like we did before. So 3x fewer expensive measurements needed. That's the way the trade-off curve works. Yeah. And another example of this is electronic voting. So there's some people at Berkeley that work on this, but it turns out that these electronic ballot counters, which are used in many states across the US, they actually do make mistakes. And they don't make mistakes that often, but elections are close, right? So you actually do need to construct like confidence intervals on the election result. That's how it's kind of done under the hood, and know when to stop early in order to call the election. And you want to make sure like there's no dust in the machine that's like, flipping the result. I shouldn't say too much political, but there's some politicians that would care to know about this sort of thing. So you want to use confidence intervals for that. And they often have people that are hand checking the ballots. Yeah, so here's an example of an error that sort of, in a system that I built to simulate one of these ballot counters, but it's just like an old school CV system that looks for like circle matching. And this ballot was misprinted. So it had all these weird lines on it. And the circle finder sort of latched onto that. And the error rate is like, 0.5% or something. But yeah, that's enough to flip an election, weirdly. And this is in some old election in SF that I was able to like call the city and get the ballot data for. So this is a great example for why prediction powered inference would be useful, because you can train a model pretty easily to like, you know, the model has like 99+% accuracy in terms of identifying who the person voted for. And then, you know, ideally you only have to label like a few hundred or a few thousand ballots in order to actually call the election. And by doing this, you know, you can decrease the number of data points that you need by like a factor of like a very large factor. I mean, like this is like a factor of 10. That's great. Okay. So the last thing I'll say here is that there's everything that I presented to you, people have been building on myself, but also my colleagues and others. And I've just put a few different ideas on the page that you might want to look at if you're interested in sort of researching similar topics. One of them, and this is one of my favorites, is active statistical inference. I can say it's one of my favorites because it's not my paper. But active statistical inference is this idea that you can actually use the model in addition to doing inference, but also to optimally collect data for the purpose of inference. So we have a model, it tells us, you know, it gives us predictions, but maybe it also gives us predictions of its own uncertainty, and how to use that optimally in order to decide, okay, based on that, which data points am I going to have the human collect? Well, you can do that, and it sort of has a reinforcement learning flavor because you're learning a policy in order to do it. Great paper. You can also do this you can also form these confidence intervals via prediction-powered bootstrap. So you don't need to use these limit theorems that we've been talking about in the course of the presentation or concentration inequality. You can also do it using resampling techniques, which is great. You don't just need imputed labels. You can also use imputed covariates. So actually the bootstrap technique allows you to do that. There's also a number of applications. So these are some folks at Google DeepMind that they're using prediction-powered inference in order to do auto-evaluation of their large language models. So when they build large language models, one of the things they're interested in is, oh, like how factual is it? And how creative is it? And so on and so forth. And it's hard to get humans to label for this thing, where it's expensive to do so. So they're incentivized in order to create auto-raters that give synthetic labels of, say, factuality and creativity. But then they're biased, right? So they're using prediction-powered inference in order to like adjust for this bias actually in the production pipeline. It's cool. And here's a paper that I sort of wrote on that topic a year or so ago. So yeah, that's where the presentation ends, and I'm happy to open it up for questions. And if anyone's interested in these topics, please talk to me. So.
I have a question here. Let's go back to, for example, mean estimation. So if I compare your confidence interval and the naive just use ground label data, whatever, the expert data set alone, could it ever happen that the two confidence intervals separate?
Certainly, yeah. Depends on the, you know.
I figure that's going to be the case, but then the conceptual question to me is like, what does it mean? Because each one is supposed to say like, I'm pretty sure the true mean is in that interval, and now I have two separate intervals. How should I think of this?
I mean, they can separate due to random fluctuation, right? Like with some small probability, I sample a data set here that's going to sort of shift.
Do you mean this separation can only happen in this sort of delta part of the? Okay, so with large probability, I can control it so that it's.
That's correct. Yeah.
Is there a notion of this delta here? That's implicit, I suppose.
It's
the 95%.
That's the 95%.
So if I replace that with delta, I guess it.
There's no high probability statement here because the only randomness that we're averaging over is the interval. So this is there's no like probability on top of the probability.
I see.
Right? This is just one probability. The probability theta star lies in the interval, which is random, is 95%. Now, this could fail, and with 5% probability, it's not contained. And the classical one could fail in the opposite direction, which happens with yet smaller probability than the 5%. And then they could not overlap.
Okay.
But that's sort of like a weird event that we wouldn't expect to happen very frequently.
Thanks.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay. More questions?
Can you say a few words about what happens when n is finite? When we don't do this like asymptotic analysis, but we have finite and Is there a way to get like a number that will give us the confidence we are looking for?
Yeah, there's no question that you can do that. So let's say we look at this term. So this is the CLT, right? So forget this. Let's say we look at this term and we're just going to do Hufting. So let's say the y's are bounded, and then, whoops, okay, actually it might be better to write it here. So the y's are bounded, and so we're going to say this thing is bounded by 2. Then what we're going to do is we're going to say, this thing is consistent for expected value yi minus yi hat. It's unbiased for that. And we're going to say plus or minus 2 times, the Hufting factor. And then this one is going to be, because it's bounded between 0 and 1, it's going to be 1 times the Hufting factor, consistent with its mean. So if you want to construct a confidence interval for the mean, you just smash these together, and you get 3 Hufting of alpha. That's it. Yeah. And that'll give you, you're just taking 2 intervals, you're smashing them together, and you're getting an interval for the mean of the sum of these 2 estimates, right? That's the easiest way to think about doing it. There's also like more advanced ways of doing it where you're coupling these into one average. But, I mean, the gains are limited. So, yeah, thank you.
Any further questions? Oh, there's one more.
Is there any kind of predictor that this doesn't work for? Are there any like fundamental limitations to your approach, or can I now use this for any predictor that I might have?
Yeah, I mean, I showed you all of the assumptions, so it will work for any predictor. It might not give you gains for any predictor. I'd say the places where I think that there's more limitations starts where you get into distribution shifts between this data and this data. So the main assumption in my view is that the ground truth labels are able to be collected on data that is IID with the data that's unlabeled. But if there's a domain shift there, you can do certain standard tricks, likelihood ratio reweighting, and so on, but there's a gap that needs to be accounted for. And that's where you start getting into, is this possible? Is this not possible? So on and so forth.
I was going to ask a related question about a sequential prediction, right? Where you may lose the IID assumption. Are there extensions to these results that you think can apply there?
Yeah, actually the active inference paper that I sort of said on my last slide has some implications on the sequential setting. You can also just like thinking about something like this. If there's martingale structure that you can, induce in your data or that exists in your data, or like slow enough variations that you can get central limit theorems on weak dependent sequences to hold, then it'll still work.
Okay.
If you know something about the shift, for example, if it follows some, like reweighting that you can undo, then it'll still work. Okay. So on and so forth.
Thanks. So one more question back there.
Yeah, just follow up on the earlier question. Is there a nice characterization of the performance gain in terms of like the KL divergence between the 2 distributions?
Like the deviation of this or the hardness of the problem.
Yeah, essentially.
With respect to this? Not that I know of. Yeah.
Okay, fair enough.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I think we've converged. Okay. Thank you again, Anastasios. All right. So we'll break for lunch and be back here by 2 o'clock for the afternoon session.